Hello, everyone. About 8 hours ago, we found out with high confidence that Abdul El Sayed will defeat Haley Stevens in the Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate seat in Michigan. This was a very hotly contested race. There was some very big themes in ideology between Abdul El Sayed and Haley Stevens. Haley Stevens representing the more moderate and establishment wing of the Democratic Party that increasingly has come under fire since the 2024 election. We start out with the major light the fire for the progressive movement and their insurgents in the party with the election of Zohran Mamdani defeating Andrew Cuomo in the Democratic Party primary, and then again in the general election, and the massive fanfare that he's generated among the progressive base. And then we start to see a lot of primaries in New York and then all throughout the country where we're starting to see progressive Democrats or even just outright socialist Democrats unseating their Democratic opponents. And these Democratic opponents, they aren't always like some hardcore moderates. Sometimes they're quite liberal. Sometimes they're progressive and they endorse progressive policies like Medicare for all. But there is like a more, I guess you could say, trying to like tackle old, more in line with traditional center left vibes that we're starting to see getting toppled by usually more younger politicians. And then, of course, the major humanitarian or the major foreign policy undercurrent is your view about what's the situation going on in Gaza. And so now we go to the Michigan Democratic primary. And it first starts out with Abdul El Sayed versus Mallory McMorrow and Haley Stevens. And Mallory McMorrow, there was a brief point where she seemed to really be gaining some momentum, but then over time it started to fizzle out. And then when she suspended her campaign, it turned into a two-man race between El Sayed and Haley Stevens. And El Sayed, he was criticizing Haley Stevens very frequently relating to Israel and AIPAC. And Haley Stevens was making a more some electability minded arguments, but then also touting her resume, the things that she did, talking very frequently about the work that she did working with the Obama administration to rescue the Michigan auto sector. And then also the other reforms that she'd made in just helping and providing constituent services to Michigan. And so she was running like, I've gotten a lot done. I have a strong track record and I'm electable. But then, of course, she also kind of represented the increasingly smaller part of the Democratic Party that is favorable to Israel or at least not unfavorable to Israel. And she didn't voice her support for Israel much in this primary, partially because the Democratic Party has shifted very much against Israel since over the last couple of years, and it's been becoming the major progressive litmus test. She didn't talk much about it, but she definitely did have a lot of support from AIPAC and more Israel-aligned groups. And she, in the past, has supported very much her support for Israel's right to defend itself, among other things. And so we had this major Israel tension. And so from looking at this situation, we see a big economic difference between El Sayed, who is either outright socialist or at least very comfortable with it, and campaigning with Hassan Piker, which has that socialist tinge to it, but then also the Israel-Palestine situation, and then Haley Stevens representing that more establishment thing. And then the way that I view it is that, first of all, I do think that there is strong merit behind Haley Stevens' electability arguments. What we started to see from a lot of polls is that El Sayed was struggling a lot in his matchups with Mike Rogers, and Haley Stevens was doing a good bit better. So I think the electability point was good. And I think that she did do a very good job of outlining her actual major accomplishments. Because one of the criticisms you see from progressives when they're criticizing the center left or the moderate is that they're not really standing for something and they're not doing something. And Haley Stevens took like a more highlighting her legislative record. And if you actually look at it, she's a quite effective legislator. She's gotten a lot done. And so highlighting her legislative record and her ability to get things done I think she did a good job of kind of highlighting that. And then there was definitely and then she very much was showed her support and her familiarity and her solidarity with the Black community. She worked very frequently with President Obama. She created ads that of Obama speaking very favorably up towards her, and then she was like much more aggressive and enthusiastic. Aggressive is a weird word, but more enthusiastic in embracing the Black community. And so what we ended up seeing from the race is that she had strong support from Black voters and then just more moderate voters as well as rural voters, especially in the eastern part of Michigan. Now, on the Israel Palestine situation, my personal take on the Israel Palestine is I do think there are very significant humanitarian issues relating to relating to the fact that innocent women and children have been killed in this war. I believe that I will say first up that my understanding of foreign policy is not as rigorous as my understanding of domestic economic policy. It's not I hedge a little bit on all of the things that I'm saying because it's possible that it could shift over time or as I look at new evidence and or as I just think about things. Um, as I look at this situation, I think the concerns are real. I think that Netanyahu is probably a bad faith actor in the way that he engages with the Biden administration, with the Obama administration, and with America overall. I think that Israel's been a bit extortionary. But one area where I would push back is considering what's happening in Gaza as a genocide. In my understanding, the major differentiation between a genocide and a war with humanitarian concerns is that self defense are elements. And there are a lot of terrorist groups, most major one being Hamas, where if they were given the opportunity, they would completely slaughter every Jew in Israel. And the major reason why they haven't, they've certainly done some in the past, but the reason why they haven't completely been able to do so is because they just can't. The reason why they haven't is because they can't. They don't have the weaponry, they don't have the military support, they don't have the resources, they don't have the institutional backing in order to get the job done. But if you're Israel and you know that there are terrorist groups that, if given the chance, would slaughter the people in your country, and it's just a matter of they don't have the resources yet, that's not exactly a soothing feeling. And so I think to some degree, you have to understand that when we say like Israel has the right to defend itself, there's a little bit, there's a good amount of understanding at the very least about the why of why they're aggressive militarily and advocating for themselves. Now, this doesn't put aside the settlements that they're creating in the West Bank. This doesn't put aside the humanitarian concerns. And I think even understanding that maybe the situation is a bit nuanced, I think you can still say that that we should reduce military aid to Israel. But I do think the situation is a little bit more nuanced, and I don't know if calling it a genocide is exactly the correct terminology. But regardless, going back to the Michigan Senate primary, the situation regarding Israel and your position on it, or rather how much you're anti-Israel, or if you're kind of like more agnostic or even supportive, that was a major theme. So if you look at El Sayed's in his press conferences, he was talking about APAC, APAC, APAC. And so this was a major thing that we saw. Whereas Haley Stevens was more like, let's focus on domestic issues in Michigan. And so this was a major theme. And then, of course, with Mamdani and with Bernie Sanders, his continued support for socialism and a more, I guess, a more progressive brand of economics, we also saw that as a major defining position. And as somebody who believes in free markets, who has read enough economic policy to lead me to believe that free market and market-friendly governance is the most effective way to improve the standard of living of the working class, especially of the long term. I am a little bit frustrated at how much the socialists have started to dominate the conversation in the Democratic Party. I think one of the problems that we see in political discourse is that when we're talking about socialism or capitalism, or neoliberalism or things of this sort, if you notice, it's very much more from a symbolic standpoint. The type of argumentation that you see is a symbolic zero sum type of thing. But the world isn't zero sum, economics isn't zero sum. And so we're not engaging properly with the fact that market based governance and focusing on creation, that this is positive sum. That when somebody creates a company and they innovate, or when they create a product that a lot of people want, and then over time they start to scale their business, they're creating new wealth and new prosperity. And there's a lot of positive spillovers from this type of activity in the form of job creation, in the form of more productive labor from their capital investments and various productivity improvements. There's a knowledge spillovers. There's infrastructure that a lot of companies build that are privately funded, but they have some social value and that other people use. There's a massive benefit that's created from digital goods, where companies, they can invest millions of hours into creating a very high quality digital good like Google Chrome or Amazon or YouTube. They can create some incredible digital goods, but because those digital goods aren't that expensive to administer once they're created, and because they're able to operate at large amounts of scale, you can provide some very high quality services for basically for free, or like a freemium model. And this is what we end up seeing. You see that TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Google Chrome, and like so many other things, and then like all ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude, they all have like some free thing available, which is like pretty incredible. And so I think there's a lot of, when we talk about economics, I think we should first of all recognize that economics isn't zero sum, it's positive sum. But then also when it comes to crafting policy, whether it's tax policy or healthcare or what have you, I think we should also engage with the fact that there are second order effects, that there can be a big divergence between the intentions of a policy and its real world effect. We see this, one of the clearest examples of this is rent control, stuff like that. And so overall, I definitely lean more towards the market friendly brand of economics. And I think that going forward, Haley Stevens didn't really push back against Abdul El Sayed in criticizing his economic worldview. Uh, but I think that going forward, if the center left really wants to make sure that it has like a strong argument besides electability, it needs to really be more rigorous in it and more ideological when it comes to advocating for center left economics, which in my view, center left economics would be market friendly governance with sensible regulation and a social safety net. Things that we've seen from Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, which is quite a bit different from what we see from Bernie Sanders or AOC or Zohran Mamdani. I think the center left is going to have to be more ideological in stating, like, here are the disagreements we have with socialism, whether it comes to nationalizing industries and the possible distortions or inefficiencies that can create all throughout the economy, or talking about the price controls that you see through things like Medicare for All or the rent control and what that can have on creating shortages of essentials, or just talking about the punishing tax environment. And you don't have to be like anti-tax, but you should be at least understand some of the trade-offs that you're making from different tax schemes, especially like stuff like the wealth tax and the disincentives that that can have on work and other forms of productive activity. So I think that, like, basically TLDR, the center left, when they're engaging in economics, they have to be a little bit more ideological and actually like push back against some of the socialist economics that we see. But Haley Stevens didn't do that, and I don't really expect her to be like very confrontational with regards to socialism. That's probably not uh, it. I That's probably something that we're going to have to go through in the 2028 presidential primary, Democratic primary. So maybe we'll see that a little bit in the future. You know, but I think that's something that we're going to have to see the center left and moderate left get a little bit more comfortable with. And so the major differences that we see between El Sayed and Haley Stevens is, first of all, on Israel, and then second of all, on that economics. And so we go to the election. El Sayed, at the time that I'm recording this, he has defeated Haley Stevens by a hair under 1%. Now, going into this election, El Sayed, if you look at the polls, he was leading anywhere between 10 and 19 points. So this was a very significant polling miss. And so you kind of ask, kind of like wonder like what happened. Is there like a shy Haley Stevens voter effect, or is it possible that it's possible that in congressional primaries these type of major polling misses can happen a lot. I was reading a Substack post from Nate Silver where he says the average polling miss in a congressional primary is 9 points. So you can kind of see that. But even still, with 9 points, this was even more than 9 points. This was something around like 15 or something. And so we saw a major overperformance from Haley Stevens. She didn't quite win, but she got quite close. And maybe it's because she got the endorsement of Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. She got the endorsement of Gary Peters, who is the current Democratic senator in this Senate class in Michigan for the Senate seat, and he's retiring, so he's going to be replaced by either El Sayed or Mike Rogers. So Haley Stevens, she had some pretty big endorsements, and then she had that kind of implicit Obama endorsement. And so I think all three of those, especially over the final stretch of the campaign, maybe had created some momentum that wasn't fully captured in the polls or something like that, that like showed up in election day, but didn't show up in polls. And so Haley Stevens had a big overperformance. And so this is going to have to, as we head into the general election, what we're going to have to see is, well, El Sayed, he only won by 1 point against somebody who is more moderate than him. And if we go by the general election polls, he's not doing that well against Mike Rogers. So something that he's going to have to do is he's going to have to figure out, how do I rebrand myself in order to be able to win in this state, because he really should be winning. Michigan is probably around like a neutral state. And then this is going to be a D plus 6, 7, 8+ point year. It could even be up to like D plus 10. So if we look at the general ballot in Michigan, it's entirely possible. It could be like D plus 6.5 or something. El Sayed should be winning that. If he's an average candidate, he would be winning by at least 5 points. Right now, what we see is he's behind Mike Rogers by a couple points. He's going to have to learn to like rebrand himself. He's going to have to do some thinking about what's causing some people to be willing to vote for Haley Stevens or willing to vote for Jocelyn Benson, who is the Democratic primary nominee, who's the Democratic nominee for the Michigan governor in 2026. What is it that is leading some of these people to be willing to vote for a Democrat, but maybe not willing to vote for me? And he's going to have to work on how to rebrand himself. And then more broadly, between this election and then also what we're seeing in the Wisconsin governor's race with Francesca Hong, we'll see if she's going to be the Democratic nominee, but it seems like that's the case. These elections are going to be a test to see the electability of the progressive left. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens. This race was pretty symbolic in how it represents some of the major factional differences we see in the Democratic Party. And I'm pretty interested to see where it goes from there. So we'll stay in touch. We'll see what happens as over this next 3 months. And then when November comes, we're going to get a lot of data, and it's going to tell us a lot about the current state of the Democratic Party, the current state of socialism as it relates to its electability and possibly its validity as an ideology. And then we'll just have to see. The data will tell us a lot about how we move as we head into the 2028 presidential election. So thank you. It's an honor to have you watching, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next video.